Hi all, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology Part 2. I'm going to very briefly go over the course syllabus with you. I can get this pulled up. But I'll expect you to kind of go over this on your own. Again, most of you are continuing on with me from the first half of this class, and our format will remain the same. So on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays at 8:30 a.m., I'll host a Zoom session. In those sessions for this half of the class, I'll be focusing more on kind of explaining what to do in the labs, and then you'll do those labs on your own. Those labs will involve more experiments and different activities and things like that. So you'll be able to complete those on your own once you receive the lab equipment, which you might have already by the time you're watching this. Other things to note, again, all the lectures will be pre-recorded, so you can watch those at your convenience and take good notes on those. Other things, my cell phone number is here, my email is here. Again, call, text, email me if you have questions or you want to meet and go over something in more detail, please do let me know. Course description, objectives, learning outcomes you can read on your own. As I mentioned, those Zoom sessions will be held Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8:30 a.m. If you cannot attend those, that's okay. I will record those and then post them immediately after our class so that you'll have access to those if you weren't able to make it. Assessment within this course, so there's 8 different quizzes. The quizzes are somewhere between 15 to 20 points each. Again, the material on the quizzes will be primarily from lecture, but there is some lab information that will be included in those as well. 3 different lecture exams. Again, those will be non-cumulative in nature, so they'll cover, the first third of the class, the second third of the class, and then the last third of the class. Format for those will be primarily multiple choice. However, there could be a couple essay questions and things like that. I'll post a study guide for you for each of those exams. My advice would be to do the lectures on the day recommended on the course calendar, take good notes, and then, fill in that, the study guide after you've done the lectures and kind of use that as a way to study. Lab homework is worth 300 points out of 800, so a pretty important component associated with your grade in this class. It'll be a variety of things. So it'll be some, summary questions, it'll be some presentations, and then it'll be a couple different lab reports. And we'll talk in greater detail about those during our first lab meeting on that Monday of class. Here's the points breakdown. Again, 800 points are total available, and your grading scale is set up the same as what we would see if you wanted to look at percentages. So 90s are A, 80s are B, 70s are C, etc. Okay. As I mentioned, attendance is not required, but I would recommend that you attend as many of those Zoom sessions as you can so that you can ask questions about the lab activities or the lab homework or questions on lecture, etc. So please make sure you do your best to attend those if you can. Okay. And I think that's pretty much it on the syllabus. Let's see, I will show you also the course calendar as well. Again, we'll stay right on course with this. Sorry, my version has a couple little notes and things like that in there. But again, just make sure you stay up on these things. Pay attention to the times that things are due on each of those days. And like I said, Zoom Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8:30 a.m. Okay. Again, we'll stay right on track with that course calendar the best that we absolutely can. I don't foresee us getting off task on that. So my goal for today is to cover our first lecture, which is about homeostasis. And again, this is kind of just an introductory lecture where we can kind of talk about the basic framework for human physiology, which is known as homeostasis. So first, Let's ask this question again, super basic and broad in nature, but what is physiology? So again, in the first half of this course, we were more focused on the anatomy portion, which is the structures of the body. And again, now we're going to focus more on the function. Okay, so physiology is the study of function, specifically the integration of how parts of the body work at various levels of organization and as an entire organism. Okay, so when we think about this integration and working together as an entire organism, there are 10 different characteristics of life. And so basically, in order for us to live, we must be able to complete these 10 processes in order to do so, right? So we must be able to continually grow and adapt to our environment. We have to have these 10 basic characteristics to allow us to survive successfully. Okay, so number one is movement. Okay, so we need to have movement of different body parts. This could also mean movement within the body as well. So again, we can think about blood movement, movement through the digestive tract, and those types of things as well. Number two is responsiveness. So being able to respond to changes that are internal and external in nature. So again, if I get too hot, for example, I need to be able to have a response so that I know how to cool down. If I get too cold, for example, I need to know how to be able to respond in order to warm myself up. Again, if I see something externally that's a threat, what can I do in order to respond to that threat and get away from it? Okay, so again, when we think of responsiveness, this is both internal and external. Number three is growth. So we need to have an increase in body size in order for us to continue to develop. And again, growth occurs as adults as well. So again, when we think about growth, it's important to consider that we need to continually have tissues grow because they need to have metabolism and metabolic processes occurring. Number four is reproduction. Again, think about this in a couple different ways. Number one is reproduction as a species. So again, it's not essential that each of us individually reproduces and has children, but it is essential that the species as a whole does that. But also reproduction could mean new cells within our body, within our own body. Okay, so again, reproduction could mean producing new humans and also new cells within our body. Number five is respiration. So we need to use oxygen and remove CO2. Again, that's going to allow us to fuel our basic metabolism, our basic metabolic processes, and also get rid of waste products. Number six is digestion. Again, this allows us to break down food so that we can use it as energy. Number seven is absorption. Again, this allows us to absorb nutrients and fluids, both. Again, we need to not only be able to digest those items, but we also need to be able to move those from the digestive tract into the bloodstream so that we can utilize them. Number eight is circulation, and this involves the movement of blood. So again, the cardiovascular system is super important for us in regards to survival, obviously. And so it's important that we're able to move the blood through the use of the heart, which is our pump. Okay. Number nine, assimilation. So changes, we need to be able to change substances into different chemical configurations. So again, this could be related to metabolism most likely. So again, I can take one amino acid and I can convert it into something else so that I can use it depending on what I need within the body. And then lastly, number 10 is excretion, or the removal of waste products. Okay, so I need to be able to get rid of those waste products. Again, that involves several different systems. Okay, so again, if I want to excrete waste, I can do that through breathing out. So that would involve the respiratory system. I can also get rid of it through feces, so through the digestive system. I can also get rid of it through the urinary system, through my urine, and then I can also actually sweat out some waste products as well. So again, lots of systems involved in that particular process or that particular characteristic. Okay. So again, if I wanted to survive as a human, there are 4 things that are required that I need in order to do so, in order to be able to complete those characteristics or those processes that we talked about on the previous slide. So number 1, what do I need? I need water. So water is the most abundant chemical in the body, and it's required for many metabolic processes or many metabolic pathways. So it's essential that I consume or have safe water available in order to survive. Okay. Number 2, I need food. Okay. I need nutrients to provide energy, regulate metabolic processes, and build and repair tissue. Okay, so I need food. I also need oxygen. Okay. And this is what I'm going to use for aerobic metabolism, which is the primary source of metabolism within the human body. I need heat, and we will produce this as a byproduct of metabolism. So again, when we break down food, about half of it approximately is going to be converted into heat. Again, that's why it's comfortable for us to, sit in a room that's 75 degrees. However, my body temperature is 90 some degrees, right? So the reason that I'm able to maintain that temperature and this is comfortable for me is because I'm constantly producing heat based on metabolism. And then lastly, I need pressure. I need pressure gradients. This will allow us to maintain many of the processes within the body. Particularly gases are going to move via a pressure gradient, but also within the cardiovascular system, the movement of blood is based on a pressure gradient as well. So we mentioned this term, and again, this was one of the terms that was used in the title of this lecture, of homeostasis. And so what are we talking about when we say homeostasis? So this refers to dynamic mechanisms that detect and respond to deviations in physiological variables from their set point. And this will initiate some sort of response involving effectors that will allow us to restore variables to their optimal physiological range, okay? So again, when we think about what this means, basically, like, we have all these different variables within the body, and your body wants to maintain them around this like very narrow set point. Again, the best example I can think of is like a thermostat, for example. Okay, so again, I want to maintain temperature within this very small range, and that is known as my set point. And if something happens to modify my temperature outside of that set point, I have several different effectors or responses that are going to allow me to, elicit a change so that I can get back to that set point. Okay. In order for us to, again, maintain this stable internal environment, the homeostasis or the homeostatic set point needs to have 3 different components. Number 1, it needs to have receptors, and receptors are going to provide information about specific stimuli in the internal environment. Okay, so again, if we continue on with our example of temperature, I have thermoreceptors that are located both internally and underneath my skin surface, and those are going to allow me to pay attention to specific stimuli within the environment. Number 2, I need to have a set point, and this is a particular range in which the body likes to stay within. Okay, so again, if I get too low on the thermometer or too high on the thermometer, I need to have some sort of change occurring because I've gone outside of that range. Okay, and that change that we will have is known as an effector. So number 3 is effector. And effectors are going to bring about responses within the system to keep the body within that set point. So again, imagine this thermometer. Let's go with in the house, for example. Okay, so I want to maintain temperature between 74 degrees and 76 degrees in the house, for example. Okay, if the temperature gets above 76, I'm able to kick on my air conditioner, and that will serve as the effector. It'll get things cooled down so that we get back down to 76 or whatever we said. Okay, same thing is true in the winter. okay, if I dip below 74, which we said was kind of the bottom of my set point, the heat will kick on. And the heat will kick on until the house warms up and it gets above that 74-degree mark. And now I've maintained temperature within that range. Okay. So again, that kind of shows you the example of how this works as it relates to in a house. Okay, so again, if things get too cold or I dip below that set point, I'm going to kick on a heater. If things get too hot and I get above my set point, I might kick on a fan or air conditioning, something like that. How does this work within the human body? Again, if I get too cold, I'm going to have shivering occur, and shivering involves the contraction of muscles, and that's going to allow us to produce heat. If I get too hot, so my set point goes above, or my temperature goes above the set point, I'm going to activate sweating, and that's going to help me to get cooled down. This is controlled through what's known as a negative feedback system. So deviation from our set point causes corrective action, okay? So again, why is it called negative feedback? So basically, like, temperature goes up, I have this corrective mechanism to get it back down, and then that mechanism is shut off, okay? So the effector is shut off. So once I cool myself back down, like if I was too hot, then sweating would stop. Again, if I was cold and I started shivering and that warmed me up enough, then shivering would eventually shut off. Okay, so that's the negative feedback loop. The reason that it's negative is because it's going to get us back within that range and then it's going to shut off or turn off. Okay, positive feedback is the opposite of this. So when you have positive feedback, a change in the set point causes a further change. Okay. So, for example, when someone goes into labor, okay, the contractions start small, but that change in set point, so that deviation from normal causes a greater change. Okay, so then those contractions get bigger, and then they get bigger, and then they get bigger, right? So again, it's a kind of a cascade of events of building and getting you further and further from that set point. Okay, so giving birth is one example. Another example is blood clotting. Okay, so once I have one molecule kind of starting to fill that particular hole or that gap or whatever it might be, then I have more, and then I have more. Okay, so again, it gets us further and further away from the set point. Okay, so again, the major difference between negative and positive feedback. With negative feedback, I'm going to have a corrective action that's going to allow me to get back to my set point, and then that mechanism is going to shut off. With positive feedback, once that change is initiated, such as labor contractions, right, they're going to build and build and build and get bigger and bigger and take us further away from set point. I just think this is funny. I'm a fan of The Office. Again, homeostasis is super important in order for us to live. Dwight knew that. So anyway, I hope you thought that was a little bit funny at least. So again, general characteristics of homeostatic control mechanisms. So again, with a negative feedback system, this just basically describes what we just mentioned on that previous example. So when we have negative feedback, a change in the variable being regulated brings about responses that push that variable in the opposite direction of the original change. Okay, so again, as I start to get hot, this effector or this response is going to allow me to start to get cooler. Okay, so it's going to go in the opposite direction of whatever that original change was. Okay. Negative feedback minimizes change from the set point of the system. So this helps us to maintain stability within the body, which is very good. Okay. Again, we have lots of different set points within the body, not just temperature, many others as well. Okay, so this shows you the example of temperature. I know I'm using temperature, but it's an easy one to kind of, I think, visualize. So let's start up here. So if room temperature decreases, so let's say it starts to get too cold in here, I'm going to start to lose more body heat, and therefore my body temperature will decrease. And then I'm going to have three different effectors. I'm going to start shivering, which is going to allow me to increase heat production. I'm going to curl up, so I might do something like this, or I might sit kind of in a curled up position, and that will prevent heat loss from my body. I'm also going to have constriction of my blood vessels. So again, I'm going to try to keep my heat at my core, and all of those mechanisms are going to work together to get my body temperature back to the original range. So one mechanism, increase heat production, and two, assisted with decreasing heat loss. Okay. So again, the idea with this is we want to minimize change within the internal environment, but we can't maintain complete constancy. So again, some of these variables are going to have a more narrow range than others, depending on like the priority, if that makes sense. So again, if multiple variables are being modified or go outside of this range, we have to kind of prioritize those depending on how important they are for us to survive. Okay, so any regulated variable will have more or less of a narrow range of normal depending on what the external environmental conditions might be like. Okay. Some set point variables that are regulated by homeostatic control can be reset, or that is, they could be physiologically raised or lowered. Okay, so weight gain or weight loss, for example, a lot of researchers believe that we have like the set point for our body weight. Okay, so again, if I start to eat too much, then my metabolism will increase in order to kind of like counteract that to help me to stay within my whatever my weight range is. And if I try to exercise and diet a little bit, then my metabolism might slow down because my body's trying to prevent me from losing weight because it wants to maintain that range, right? However, if I continuously overeat and am not exercising, we know that weight will increase, right? So weight gain, we can modify that set point by doing those things, by eating too much and by not exercising enough, right? So we can modify that set point. Blood pressure and cholesterol are two other examples. Again, if I'm not leading a healthy lifestyle, it's easy for me to develop hypertension, right? I get to the top end of my normal range for blood pressure, and then I keep creeping up, and all of a sudden I'm hypertensive or I have high blood pressure. Okay. Same with cholesterol as well. High cholesterol would be, related to kind of this physiological raising of what's considered normal or what would be a normal set point. Okay. Another example, a good example of deviation from homeostasis is exercise. Exercise is a planned deviation from homeostasis. Again, my resting heart rate is 60. When I do exercise, maybe it's 150 or whatever, depending on how hard you're working. Your body knows that that's a planned deviation, right? And when you first start exercising, like if you're just getting into fitness, for example, your body will kind of fight back on that, right? So it doesn't want you to deviate from set point because it wants you to survive. And survival tells us that we need to maintain stable environments, right? So it's very difficult for people to get going in an exercise plan, probably at least partially because of the effects on homeostasis that we see. So that's kind of interesting. Okay. Again, like I mentioned, it's not always possible for everything to maintain within their small window. So again, there's a hierarchy of importance, such that the constancy of certain variables may be altered to maintain others at a relatively constant level. So again, we'll kind of prioritize those depending on, the threats that we are facing. So within the body, we need to have communication as well. And so we have these intercellular communication reflexes going on, local responses that are achieved by neurotransmitters, hormones, and paracrine or autocrine substances. So less common is intracellular communication, either through gap junctions or cell-bound messengers. So 3 different ways we can communicate. I think I have these listed on the next slide as well, but paracrine is going to cause a change in a substance nearby. Autocrine is going to cause changes within that same tissue or within that same cell. And then endocrine, which you don't see listed here, is going to signal a target cell. So as I mentioned, 3 different categories. Yeah, I thought they were on this slide. So again, endocrine is going to have an effect on something that's, further away. Okay, so distant target. Paracrine is going to reach a neighboring cell and have a signal that way via interstitial fluid. That's what that is. And then autocrine, again, is going to have an effect on its own self. Okay, so it's going to signal its own cell or its own tissue. Again, we'll use different binding sites in order for the receptors to have an effect. And again, these different messengers are going to help us regulate or help us to try to regulate homeostasis. Okay, here you can kind of see an example of what we're talking about. So again, if I am an endocrine messenger, I'm going to have a hormone secreting gland, usually an endocrine gland of some sort. Again, I'll release a hormone into the bloodstream. It'll travel in the bloodstream and have an effect on a target cell. Again, the nervous system can also do these types of things as well. I can have a hormone released via neural impulse, and that'll have an effect on target cell, or I can have a neural cell send a neurotransmitter, and that'll be really fast, and this will have an effect on a cell as well. Again, paracrine agent is going to affect a local cell. Okay, so somebody that's its neighbor, basically. And then the autocrine agent is going to have an effect on itself. Okay. Again, so a given signal can fit into all 3 categories as well. So the steroid hormone cortisol, for example, affects the cells that are that make it. It also affects cells nearby, and then it can also be carried in the bloodstream and affect distant target tissue as well, such as muscles and the liver. So again, this tells us that it's important that cortisol is doing important work, and that it's important that these signals are pretty darn complex, actually. So we have 3 different processes to kind of think about as it relates to homeostasis. We have adaptation. And adaptation is a characteristic that favors survival in a specific environment. So homeostatic control systems are inherited biological adaptations. Okay. So again, I want to become more efficient, and then I want my child to become more efficient as well. So if something's working for me and making me more efficient, it's more likely that I will pass that on, right? So again, these are inherited biological adaptations that we make. Okay. Acclimatization is improved functioning of an already existing homeostatic set point. Okay. So for example, when you are regularly exposed to heat, you become better at coping with the heat, or better at responding to the heat. Okay, so I already have this mechanism that allows me to monitor temperature within myself. Okay, but as I become more and more exposed to heat, so I live in Iowa in the summer, for example, and it gets super hot and I like to be outside a lot, my body will enhance its ability to survive in that particular environment the more I'm in it. Okay, so acclimatization is enhancing a homeostatic system that I already have. Okay. And then I also have biological rhythms as well, which I think is super interesting. Biological rhythms are rhythmic changes in body function. The most common of the biological rhythms that we might think of are circadian rhythms. And this is a cycle that occurs approximately every 24 hours, okay? And things that can change within this 24-hour period are body temperature, sleep-wake cycle. So again, there's a certain hormone that's going to be released when it's dark out that tells me that I should be tired. And so then I go to sleep. And then I love in the summer, I'll sleep with the windows open and the shades up. And so like at 5:15 or whatever, I never use an alarm in the summer. At 5:15 or whatever time the sun comes up, the sun comes in the window and you stop producing, or you stop secreting, I shouldn't say producing, you stop secreting that particular hormone, and then you wake up. Okay, so again, I just love that. I love waking up kind of like naturally. And so by being able to see the light come in your window, you can do that. Again, that might be hard for college students if you guys have and maybe not as a consistent of a sleep cycle as what maybe your average adult may have. Let's see what else. Other changes that we see within this 24-hour cycle, hormone concentrations within the blood. So, for example, growth hormone, cortisol, testosterone, those are all like cyclical. Okay, so they're going to be released at certain times during the day. So, like for example, testosterone and growth hormone are released when we sleep, which is why sleep's an important part of recovery from exercise, is because those hormones are going to allow us to begin to recover from something hard that we might have done during that day. Also, excretion of ions in the urine are on a biological rhythm as well. Here you can see some of those biological modifications. So here you can see within a 24-hour period, you can see the changes in body temperature. You can see growth hormone. Again, this darker blue, it represents sleeping. So when I'm sleeping, I release more growth hormone, which allows me to repair and recover. Body temperature, again, kind of rises throughout the day and then will dip down when we sleep. Cortisol, again, I said, would also be higher when we're sleeping. And again, that's going to help us to recover. Okay. When we think about balance in the homeostasis of chemical substrates within the body. Many of our homeostatic systems regulate the balance between addition and removal of chemicals from the body. And we have something known as a pool. And a pool occupies a position of central importance in the balance sheet. This represents the body's readily available quantity of a substance and often represents the amount within the extracellular fluid. Okay, so again, we think about this pool, it just allows us like the space so that we have like this buffer, right? So imagine that this is like your pantry at your house, okay? There's a bunch of green beans and there's probably in my pantry, there's a couple bags of chips and there's always going to be some pasta in there and different things like that. I can pull from that pool anytime I want, right? So again, I've got a bunch of extra stuff in there and I can pull from those if I need to use them, right? So this kind of shows you the one representation of how this pool works. So again, I've got kind of a bunch of chemicals, and what am I going to do with those? Well, I can store them. I can convert some of them into other molecules. I might be able to get rid of them in some sort of way. I might utilize them in the form of metabolism, and I can get them from a variety of places as well. So I can get some chemicals from foods, I can get some from the air that I breathe, and then I can also make some within the body. Right, so again, this is very dynamic in nature and it's constantly changing. So we're constantly pulling from this pool depending on what it is that I might need. Okay, so some of the potential inputs and outputs can affect the pool material. Again, like glucose, it's a dynamically regulated physiological variable. Okay. Again, just a short little introduction here to how the body is organized. So again, we can look at not only the systems within the body, but the types of tissues that we have. So cells are differentiated and classified under 4 major umbrella types. So again, looking at the 4 different types of tissue that I have, or the 4 different types of grouped cells, you could say. So we have muscle, we have nervous tissue, we have epithelial cells or epithelial tissue, and then we also have connective tissue as well. Okay. Again, those of you who were around for the first half of this class, this image should look familiar. It just kind of shows us the general structure of organization within the human body. So we'll start kind of at the lowest level here and kind of define these. But an atom, at the chemical level, atoms form molecules such as CO2 or H2O. Then molecules can be multiple atoms kind of linked together. Then we have macromolecules, and this includes carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and then RNA, DNA. These can serve as building blocks of structures at the cellular level. Okay. Organelles are specialized, specialized molecules that are going to complete a specific task within the cell. And then when we look at tissues, tissue is a group of cells that work together to perform a common function. Again, the 4 types of tissue we defined on the previous slide were epithelium, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. An organ is a discrete structure that's made up of more than one tissue. Most organs contain all 4 types of tissue. The brain and the heart are 2 examples of different organs. An organ system involves a group of organs that are going to work closely together to accomplish a common task. So for example, the cardiovascular system involves the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood, and they're going to work together in order to do a variety of things. Okay. The organ systems that we do have within the human body, and again, we'll cover, I think, every single one of these in this class. So we've got cardiovascular, pulmonary, integumentary. We don't cover that in this class because we covered it in the previous class. Skeletal, muscular, digestive, lymphatic, nervous, urinary, reproductive, and immune. Okay. So again, organs and organ systems. Again, an organ is composed of 2 or more kinds of tissue, and an organ system is a collection of organs that are going to work together to perform some sort of overall function. So let's take a look at each of those organ systems and what their primary functions are. Okay. Again, these are pretty simple. We'll get into greater detail as it relates to each of these organ systems as we move to each of these units throughout the class. Okay. But circulatory system, its job is to transport blood throughout the body's tissues. Respiratory system is going to help us exchange oxygen and CO2 and also regulate hydrogen levels. The digestive system is going to help with digestion and absorption of nutrients and water. The musculoskeletal system is going to provide support, protection, and movement within the body. The immune system is going to provide us with a defense against foreign invaders. The nervous system will help us with regulation and coordination of many activities, including states of consciousness and also higher order cognition, so cognitive thinking. And then the endocrine does a bunch of stuff. So the endocrine will help us with regulation and coordination of more automatic activities such as growth, metabolism, reproduction, and electrolyte balance. And then lastly, the integumentary system, also known as our skin, is going to protect us against injury and dehydration and defense against any foreign invaders. Again, a few other kind of fundamentals when we think about homeostasis. Cells are the fundamental units of life and exchange nutrients and waste with their surroundings. So intracellular fluid is conditioned um, by interstitial fluid, which is conditioned by the plasma, which is conditioned by the organ systems that it passes through. So again, when we think about these fluids within the body, right, they're all interrelated and they're all kind of modified based on what's going on in the other locations, right? So again, a lot of communication going on as it relates to fluid balance within the body, which is good. Okay. A couple different terms when we look at fluid and fluid location. So we have extracellular fluid, and extracellular fluid is the fluid in the blood and fluid surrounding cells. We have plasma, which is the fluid portion of the blood. We have interstitial fluid, which is the remaining extracellular fluid without plasma volume. And interstitial fluid is about 75 to 80% of the fluid that we have. So it's like not inside cells, and it's also not inside the blood. It's just like kind of floating around, I guess. Interstitium is the space in which interstitial fluid is contained. So the interstitium kind of like holds the interstitial fluid. And then intracellular fluid is inside of a cell, the fluid inside of a cell. This kind of shows you the interplay between each of these things. Okay, so intracellular fluid can be seen here. So again, that's the fluid within cells. Interstitial fluid makes up about 80% of the extracellular fluid, and plasma volume makes up about 20% of the extracellular fluid. Again, extracellular fluid is about 40% of our total body water. Okay, again, but we can pull from any of these locations if we need to. So exchange and communication are key concepts for understanding how physiological homeostasis is maintained. All right. I think that's it for lecture 1. Again, thanks for tuning in, and let me know if you do have any questions.